Okay, good morning everybody, and like I said, welcome to the Innovation Imperative, Future-Proof Your Business. Today we're talking about a culture for success, and I want to start with introducing you to my team. I'm Janine Waters and I'm a partner here at BDO, heading up our Human Capital Advisory team here in Sydney. Today we're also joined by Marianne Carter, who's our Senior Manager, and Vanessa Vaillant, who is our Manager in our People Advisory business. So the three of us have some really diverse backgrounds, and hopefully today you'll get the opportunity to hear some really different experiences that we've had. I've got a background of 20 years of in-house human resource management before I became a consultant 3 years ago, and I worked for organisations such as Johnson & Johnson, Merck Sharp and Dome. Marianne's also got a lot of in-house HR experience in organisations such as Mars. And Vanessa has joined us from our BDO Canada business, where she's worked as a consultant for too many years to count and has amazing insights into some of the organisations that we've worked with across now Australia and Canada. So like I said, today we're really excited to bring this webinar to you, and we're going to explore the role of culture in the innovation imperative, and really practically we're going to look at the elements of culture that you can influence to drive cultural change in your organisation. So I wanted to start with just talking you through a little bit about what we heard. Sorry, I'm going to try and move through the slides, but here we go. What we heard from Sean Pascoe and Shane Swift in our previous webinars. So for those of you who didn't get a chance to join those webinars, they are available on our internet page, and you're very welcome to internet site, or yep, Maddie's making noises at me. So anyway, they'll be available there. Sean originally took us through the findings of the BDO Risk Landscape Report that we release on a yearly basis. It's a gathering of insights from more than 500 business executives across 55 countries and a range of sectors on their perceptions of risk in the present and in the future for their organisation. So Sean took us through some of those insights, and then Shane took us on a journey to understand more about the digital and technology landscape and how a digital strategy can position you to manage risks and leverage opportunities within your organisation. So a little bit more of the detail and really why we're focusing on innovation and agility as part of the theme for these series of webinars. The report that we had this year really revealed that business leaders across the Asia Pacific and globally are feeling the effects of a riskier world, in particular with regulation producing the most powerful blind side of risk. And you know, I've worked in some really highly regulated organisations where I can see how impactful that is. Employees start to feel that they are continually restrained by further and further governance requirements on them, and that they feel that they've got less and less opportunity to have an impact in their roles. And it can be a real challenge for organisation to upskill themselves quickly and deliver on those governance requirements. But what we saw in the report is that those who are more agile and harness innovation are typically going to be those who are also more successful. So the key themes that were expressed in the 2018 report were all about culture, governance, technology, and customer centricity. And those are the internal forces that drive agility and innovation in an organisation. There was also, as I said, an emphasis on the importance of those external pressures and forces organisations face that they can't control. Put simply, a business must have a top-down strategy that guides innovation internally. It must be conscious of the external factors that are driving it to change and the possible mechanisms, whether they're technology, culture, or otherwise, that will facilitate innovation. Importantly, we can control our responses to those external forces, while we can't control the forces themselves. So, for example, whilst we might not be able to control a regulatory change, with a strong governance and leadership approach, we can be innovative and agile in our response to the risk of non-compliance in these changes. So to find out more about that, you can actually have a read of the Risk Landscape Report. There was lots of really great information in there, and frankly, we spent hours trawling through it to pull out what we thought was really important and relevant. And there's a lot of content there, and you can also access those webinars that were previously run by Sean and Shane. And next week, there's also going to be a webinar run by Adam Sims that's going to focus on forensics and the relevance that that brings to this discussion. But for today, as I said, what we're going to really talk about is culture. And I wanted to start with the really simple question of what is culture? We know that it's a key differentiator between companies that sustain winning performances and those who barely meet average benchmarks. However, it can be ambiguous and hard to define. And more importantly, it can be hard to change if you don't know how to leverage the right impacts. If you Google organisational culture for a definition, you'll find approximately 29 million responses. So if you want to do that, go ahead. But we distilled it down a little bit. Many of them will use the iceberg image that you see here today or something similar to try and help describe the elements of culture. And it's a really good way of depicting it, I think. You know, it's a similar thing when you see trying to describe a personality for an individual. What you see at the top and above the surface are the behaviours and practices that create your visible culture. This is what your customers see. This is what your employees see when they walk in the front door of your organisation. Below the surface are the elements that create and drive these more visible components. They're the values, the beliefs and the attitudes that are at the core of your organisation. You can't see them themselves, but you can see the behaviour that they drive. Corporate culture specifically refers to the beliefs and behaviours that determine how a company's employees and management interact and handle outside business transactions. Often, corporate culture is implied. So for many organisations, it's just developed over time. It hasn't necessarily been engineered in any particular way, and it comes about quite organically. And that can be great if it's the organisational culture that you're trying to drive. The challenge can be if it's not actually where you want your organisational culture to be, how do you impact and influence it?
And what I love about what we're going to be covering today is that actually we've broken down the different elements for you so that if you're wanting to make a shift or you want to nudge your culture, make it more innovative and agile, actually you will know the exact levers to pull.
I love that, Marianne, because I can tell you 10 years ago when I was sitting in an organisation as a sole HR practitioner and my GM's sitting there saying to me, we want to drive cultural change, and I was sitting there trying to figure out how do I actually make that happen. I would have loved to have had this model in front of me and to be able to look at those different levers and figure out, well, how do I actually, where do I focus and how do I start? And I will say as well, a lone person sitting in HR on their own is not going to be able to create extensive cultural change across an organisation, and that will come through as we talk today around that real importance of leadership in creating and driving cultural change in your organisation. But before Marianne takes us through that model, and then Vanessa gives us some more insight into that from an innovation perspective, what we wanted to do is just talk a little bit about the reality in Australia and why cultural change has become a really important discussion in organisations. The Royal Commission into Banking really brought out a couple of key points around the impact of culture on your success as an organisation. And the kinds of quotes that you see here today around you don't see this sort of systematic decision making in organisation because of one or two bad apples. Okay, what you see is this is a culture that we have, and we've driven that certain types of behaviour, and that was really, really pertinent as we went through some of those findings. And then as I start to look at the landscape in Australia over the next 12 months, this is becoming more and more in our nature of what we're talking about. You know, the discussion I had this week here was around the fact that the next Royal Commission has been announced into aged care. And you think about, so what are those organisations going to be looking at as they try to understand, leading into this Royal Commission, the culture that they have in their organisation and how that might be supporting either a positive environment and good outcomes for their customers, or some challenging behaviour and conduct that may not look so great in a Royal Commission type environment. So with that context in mind and understanding that, you know, every industry is going to be slightly different and have some slightly different areas that they're going to focus on, Marianne's going to take us through how do we actually understand the cultural chain and what does that actually mean for us when we're trying to drive organisational change.
Okay, thanks, Janine. I'm really excited to be talking to you about the culture chain. And what I also would like to just mention now is that I'm actually going to walk you through the different elements of what makes a culture, so that if you're wanting to nudge or shift your culture, you know exactly what elements you're meant to be moving. and how to move those elements. And then what I really love is that Vanessa will come in afterwards and actually she'll embed what does it look like when you're innovative. So yep, these are the levers, but actually she will share with you what is the research around innovation and agility and what are the components there that you will then use these elements to leverage. So on this slide, I've got a big, basically, culture chain. And what I'm going to do is actually break down the different elements of it and walk you through how it actually impacts organisational culture. So as Janine mentioned at the beginning, as BDO found from the report that they did, actually the number one first step that organisations need is a very clear organisational strategy. And it's not, too far-fetched to actually recognise the fact that you may have an organisational strategy, but actually it may not be embedded everywhere.
It's interesting you say it, Marianne. I mean, we often go into clients and one of the first things we usually try to do is understand what does life look like in that client space now, regardless of what project we're working on. And the first thing we try to understand is the organisational strategy. I think it's fairly telling that for the majority of organisations, they will find it hard to find the organisational strategy, and they'll often find it hard to communicate it to us without a document. And the further down we go in an organisation, often the harder it is for an employee to tell us what that strategy is. So too often, that organisational strategy sits as a document that sits just with the leaders, the most senior leaders, and doesn't permeate down.
Yeah. And for those of us that have great organisations that are very visible and very good at, this is our organisational strategy, this is how each department feeds into it, well, that's fantastic. That's actually the first step.
Yeah.
So that's our number one. The next one is our cultural contributions. Now, I am going to spend a bit of time on this one bubble. And what I'm going to do is actually break down 6 levers for you. And these 6 levers talk to the 6 levers you pull on or push on to actually create an organisational culture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with rituals. They are the first lever that you use. And here, what I really want you to think about is in your organisation, do you celebrate birthdays? Do you have Friday night drinks? Do you recognise years of service? Actually, do you do an acknowledgement of country? Think about the rituals that your organisation has and think about what are you reinforcing to your employees. So from the things that you're doing, what are you telling your employees about what it is like to be working here? What are the things that we value here?
And I think the important thing to think about here is that there are no fixed elements. When we talk about birthday celebrations or Friday night drinks, there are no core set of rituals that will drive the exact culture that you want. What it is actually about understanding how they align to the culture that you're trying to have. So I've worked in organisations where we talked about Friday night drinks all the time, but the fact of the matter is we had older employees with young families who, would very rarely turn up to a Friday night drinks. Didn't work for that business and for the type of culture that we were trying to create. So it's not about the what, it's actually about the why of those rituals and the messages that those rituals send, and being able to respect the different elements of people within your organisation with those rituals.
Exactly. So, with the rituals, I want you to think about if there's differences across your organisation. And the reason why I want you to think about it is because at the centre of all these 6 levers that I'm going to be explaining is the line manager or leadership. And so with every element that we're going to be talking about today, actually it's how the leader does it, what they do and what they bring out that actually makes the biggest impact. So rituals is one. The next one are values. Here, are these values on the wall? Are they not on the wall? Do people actually know what your organisational values are? Can they tell you what they are and what they mean? Now, this is important because what you're saying is, hopefully, in an integrated model, actually, we hire people with these values. This is what we aspire to be behaving like or aligning to. So for instance, if you have an organisation where your values are imaginative, what are the behaviours that come out of that? Do people think more outside the box? Are they always thinking about new ways of approaching situations? Are they looking at partnerships when actually organisationally you're not ready for partnerships? How imaginative do you allow them to be?
I think the thing on values that I find really interesting, Marianne, is first of all, you talked about whether or not they're on the wall. And it's interesting because values being on the wall, I know isn't the be all and end all. However, as you get bigger as an organisation, being able to communicate your values really effectively is. And I've worked with startup companies, and I know, you know, one of the conversations I've had with them is, I don't want our values to just be something on the wall. And I agree, you don't ever want them to just be something on the wall. But as you get bigger and bigger as an organisation, sometimes you have to pick some really obvious ways to reinforce your values, because otherwise, how do you get them through to everyone? So whilst on the wall is one aspect, also how do you recruit for them? How are they asked in questions? How do you support them in a discussion that you have? And I think one of the most powerful examples of a values-based culture that I've worked in is Johnson & Johnson. And often the credo is you know, well studied within J&J, and I can say as an employee there for 10 years, it's very well embedded from a values perspective. And it's interesting because it has a really strong cue. If you're in a meeting with somebody and you say, I need to have a credo conversation here, everybody in the room knows what we're challenging right now is, are we aligning to our values in whatever it is that we're talking about here? So it'll be different for everybody, and you know, the J&J culture has built up over a very long period of time, but having those values really core, having everybody understand them and being able to challenge decisions, etc., based on those values is a really critical component to building that culture chain.
Yeah. And so what I might do is now move on to another lever.
Please.
So we've just spoken about two. One was rituals, the other one is values. Now we're going to be talking about structure. I can't tell you how many times organisations or people in organisations talk about, we're going through a structure change. Oh, we're now focusing on a structure change. Now, that's not what I'm going to be talking about here. What I'm going to talk about is what the research tells you about the impact your structure has on culture. So for instance, I want you to think about within your organisation, from the person that sets the strategy all the way to the person that is frontline with your customer, how many layers are there? If there are many layers, I want you to consider how impactful are your line managers if there are so many layers? And what are the messages that the people that are frontline with your customers actually receiving if they're having to receive messages through many layers? So a lot of the research talks about great cultures don't have a lot of layers, because with every layer you strip away important content and important messaging from the customers all the way to the people making the strategies and setting the direction, but also from people setting the direction straight through to the customers. So I just want you to think about that, and we've got lots of models that talk about what is ideal for your industry and what it looks like. The other part of it is when you think about your line managers, I want you to think about what is their span of control. Do you have a lot of line managers that actually only manage one or two people? And if that's the case, just think about, what are you allowing that manager and those people to do? Are they working on the same things? Is delegation happening appropriately? Is that manager able to elevate that person and bring out the best in them if they're working really side by side and on a lot of the similar things? Two, all the way up the other spectrum, let's say you've got a care industry or manufacturing, and you've got one line manager to 20 or 30 employees. What is the likely impact that manager is going to have on your employees? And vice versa, that amount of employees, what's the impact they're going to have on your line manager? Now, layers and spans are very, very important when it comes to culture and what it is you are trying to achieve.
It's really interesting, Marianne, because if I think about a number of the reorganisations we've done in the past, often when we talk about spans of control, the main discussion that we're having around the table and from a leadership perspective is from a finance perspective. You know, what does that span of control mean in a spreadsheet that we might be reporting up to the US, etc., and what's allowable there, as opposed to really consciously thinking about those structural elements from a culture perspective. So it's really interesting to think about it in both ways when you're starting to think about how you optimally structure your organisation.
Yeah, and so far we've spoken about 3 cultural levers that you can pull. One is not more important than the other, only for the fact that everyone listening, I just want you to consider the fact that so far we've spoken about 3 and they all have impact on culture. The next one I'd love to chat about is symbols. So when you think about symbols, I actually want you to think about the work environment you're in or have been in before. Research actually shows that the symbols that you tell your people, show your people, actually impact the way that they think and feel. So for instance, is your organisation recognised as a great place to work or an employer of choice? Do you win awards for the well-being work that you do? Do you talk openly and celebrate openly the work that you do in terms of environment and how you actually contribute to a better world? Do you have a rainbow accreditation? What are these different accreditations and stories that you're putting with your people, allowing them to think and feel? And another part of it is, what is the physical environment like? Physical environment is one of those things that absolutely costs money a lot of the time, and people actually push it to one side, but has huge impacts to morale.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think again, one of the startup organisations that we work with as a client, and I walk into their front door and there's a couple of really big symbols that they have when you walk in. One, they have photographs of their customers, big photos that are quite empowering as you walk in. And as they're a disability service provider, those customers have a really big presence from a photography perspective. So that's really important. Also, when you walk in, there's no reception. So any person in the organisation is encouraged to come and talk to you to find out who you are and how they can help. And that really helps their organisation, who strongly believes in not having too many levels and not having any hierarchy, and in fact having quite a servant leadership. So there's no one person responsible for greeting people, everybody's responsible for greeting people. So those are a couple of really strong symbols when you walk into that organisation. You also walk into their kitchen area. So you'll often walk into a whole group of people sitting and chatting. And they're all about how those symbols reflect on the culture that they're trying to drive and create. It's really powerful and impactful. Now for us here, obviously it's really different. We're in a much bigger corporate workspace, but even thinking about the different levels around, our personal workspaces, are you allowed to personalise them? Are you allowed to bring an element of yourself to work? Those have really strong impacts for people in terms of how they feel and the culture that you create.
Yeah. They're things that we don't think about enough, I think.
And to your point, they're costly. So, as we work in a world of more hot desking type environments, you have to understand the impact from a cost perspective as well as from a cultural perspective.
Yeah. The 5th element I want to talk about now is systems. So, for some of us, we love systems, others not so much, but actually your systems say a lot to your people and actually tells them a story about what you value. So when you think about your systems, I actually want you to think about, are they intuitive? Do they make sense for your people? If your systems are used in front of customers, do they actually make the customer experience better? Or are they taking a piece away from what it is your people are trying to achieve? Think about your recruitment systems. What's the experience likely candidates are feeling or seeing? Or even expenses. Do you make it easy for people to get on with it, put their expenses in, and then focus on other things? Or are you making it difficult because you're not necessarily listening to perhaps some of the feedback that's coming in? So as big as systems can be for some of us, actually they're quite impactful and tell a story on whether or not you value process and systems or not.
And Marianne, what's really interesting, if you ever want to understand how your systems have an impact in your culture, is to talk to someone who's new. Because often, as you've been in a company for a long period of time, you just get used to it, and it's just the way you do things. And after a while, you actually forget how cumbersome your systems are because you've figured out how to get around them. There's nothing more impactful than talking to someone who's been in your organisation for 2 or 3 weeks and listening to the frustrations they're experiencing, because it really shines a spotlight on things that you've probably forgotten about. So that can be a really neat strategy on any of these elements, actually, is talking to someone who's new, because they're going to give you that flavour really quickly around what are some of the things that you're doing as an organisation at the moment that are driving the culture that you've created.
Very true, very true. And then the last element of the culture model that you could leverage and leave and pull, basically, is measurement. Lots of us have heard, you know, you get what you measure. What gets measured gets results. Well, it does if what you're measuring is actually linked to your strategy and to your values. So I want you to think about, again, in your organisation, what do you measure? Do you measure your employee experience? Do you know how your people feel, and what do you do with those measurements? Do you measure your customer experience? How aligned is your customer experience to your people experience? Do your organisational competencies actually rush all through your employees straight through to your customers? Because actually your employees show what it is like to work within your company. If you write board papers, what is it that you are sharing, and why are you sharing that? Are those measurements allowing your organisation to move a step forward to what it is you're aspiring to? So at that point, they are the 6 elements of culture, and what sits in the center of all those elements is actually leadership. So how do your leaders bring out those 6 elements? How do they allow those 6 elements to continually improve? And what conversations do they have every day with your people around those elements? What are the behaviours and decisions they make every day around those 6 elements? And how do you train them to be able to, and empower them to be able to actually show what your organisation stands for?
I think to bring it all into your mind, what can be really helpful, and what I did as we went through building this model, was to actually sit back and think about different leaders that I've worked with, really effective ones and maybe not so effective ones. And as you think about, I think about one that comes to mind, where we had an organisational culture which was fairly good in terms of innovation. There was lots of good decisions happening. People felt relatively empowered, I think, on a day-to-day basis to make the decisions that were right for them in their parts of the organisation. And overnight we had a new leader appointed to the organisation, and within the space of a couple of months I could see how they had pulled on some of these levers, and unfortunately from an innovation perspective not for the good of the business, because they particularly loved to get involved in everything. And it wasn't a bad thing, they were a great person, we loved working with them, but the problems that came about from that was all of these elements of the culture change started to get impacted, and some really obvious ones were their willingness to actually let go of decisions. They would go and change decisions along the way, and that gave some really strong symbols out to the organisation around what was important. What the reasons why they made decisions weren't necessarily tied to what we were measuring as an organisation. So all of a sudden you started to veer off from that organisational strategy. So when you sit back and think about some of your really effective leaders and some of the really effective cultures that you've worked in, all of a sudden you can start to see how pulling in a couple of these areas only can actually have a dramatic impact, whether it's steering your culture towards what you're trying to create or steering it in that opposite direction.
Yeah, and what we're going to be going through shortly, in a matter of just a couple of minutes, Vanessa's going to actually walk us through the innovation culture and actually the elements that help elevate it. So what I'll do is just I'll continue with the culture chain. So we've got our org strategy, we've gone through the cultural contributions, and as Janine has said, that directly impacts the individuals in your organisation and therefore the group behaviours. They become that iceberg that Janine spoke about, that big piece of iceberg under the water. All of a sudden, we all know how it's done around here. So whether I'm going to say it or not, I know how it moves. But they are the 6 elements driven by your line managers that actually impact that piece. Then, without a doubt, what your employees feel directly impacts what your customers see. So if you are not driving an innovative culture, if you're not using the different elements to drive that, they're not going to see innovation. Your product, if you're selling a product, may be seen as an old school product. Or if you're looking at services, are you moving services to what it is that your customers are wanting or your clients are wanting? And then all of that comes together to actually set the tone. Are you meeting your objectives, or are you thriving and smashing them out the ballpark? And all of that can happen with a very clear organisational strategy and knowing how to pull on the cultural contributions and the levers that we spoke about. So I'm really excited about this next piece now, because Vanessa's actually going to share a lot of the research and her experience around what innovation looks like so that you can embed this in this model.
Thanks, Marianne. Such great insight to date on the cultural chain. It's very helpful to understand how it flows through the organization and impacts individuals. So now we're talking about the attributes of an innovative culture. So what does it look like to be innovative? There's really no one size fits all, obviously. It depends on your organizational mandate, your strategy, your people, your leaders. But this is our findings and our research based on our experience and client work to date around what we've identified as some of the key attributes of cultures that are working towards innovation or have already achieved a certain level of innovation. As we walk through this slide, just think about how innovative your organization is today. And then also think about where you might want to be in some of these areas in the future. Maybe you're happy with where you are today and you just want to keep forward. But again, in this constant era of change, if you're not moving and shifting your culture, then someone else will be, and you may be left behind. So think about these questions as we walk through these 5 attributes, and you'll see at the center is the values, attitudes, and behaviors to really execute on all of these characteristics. The first one is relationships, and this is about enabling people interactions. So allowing for the space and the time for those interactions to happen outside the day-to-day operations, because that creates energy and excitement to surface new ideas that may not happen within your day-to-day routine when you're talking to the same people in and out of meetings. It needs to be deliberate that you're enabling people to have interactions outside your current space. There's also an element in relationships around collaboration. So we often hear that you're better together. Collaboration is a buzzword of the moment. But really, you need to think about how you're creating opportunities for people to collaborate at different levels within your organization. And one easy way to think about that is through the spaces. Marianne and Janine both talked about the spaces within your organization. And do you have informal spaces where people can come together and connect and share ideas and sketch on a whiteboard and just brainstorm or storyboard and allow for those opportunities and those conversations in a less structured environment?
I think it always reminds me when you talk through this, Vanessa, of the old adage of the water cooler and how much information is shared in that environment. And I was listening to, I think it was a podcast the other day, and they were talking about the decision that Yahoo made to cancel working remotely at one point. And the reason why they said they did that was that they wanted their employees to be in the office because they recognized exactly what you're talking about here around relationships and developing the relationships and around collaboration. Now, I'm actually not advocating that companies who want to become innovative cancel their work from home or remote work policies, because there are some really positive elements to that as well. But it is important to think about how do you create that dynamic for your employees to work together. And when you do have a lot of remote workers, how do you actually create a space where they actually can come together and build that dynamic flow of ideas?
Yeah. Actually, I just want to add, Vanessa, you raised a really good point around collaboration. And one thing that comes to mind a lot that I see within our clients is that at times we tend to only listen to the people that have outcomes or options to offer.
Yeah.
And actually the higher up people go, that's all they want to hear. I want to hear your outcomes. I want to hear your options.
Solutions.
Give me your solutions. When actually, when you're collaborating with people that are actually very good at telling you what the risks are. So when you're collaborating, you need to be collaborating and talking to people with different mindsets so that you are able to move the organisation forward or to solve your problem in a different space and a different way.
Absolutely. That's a great point, Marianne. And that leads to the next one, which is actually valuing. Organizations that are innovative tend to value external relationships as well as client insight. So now more than ever, companies are forced to be aware of the power of the customer, the consumer. So what are they saying? What services are they looking for? How do they want them to be delivered? They have a strong voice, and the expectations are increasing at the customer level because of innovation. And it's important to build those relationships with your clients or your customers and really hear what they have to say. You don't have to necessarily use it all, but it's an important information point to acquire knowledge and also distribute some of your knowledge. And the same goes for external stakeholders, because that can also lead to co-innovation opportunities that you may not have seen had you not had those relationships with those key stakeholders.
Exactly, and a lot of the research we've done actually are the organisations that are able to partner externally, not just internally, are the ones that are producing the innovative client services, the innovative products, because they've now got more in their bag that they're bantering and listening on. So it's really quite powerful.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. You cannot underestimate the value of relationships and understanding your strengths.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the next attribute or characteristic, which is motivation. So innovative organizations, you'll notice, or we've noticed in our experience, and you may have the same perception, that the people within the organization often are passionate and take pride in their work or their product or the brand. And it's not hard to spot in most cases. It happens in the office, but also externally. You can really feel someone's energy when they're passionate and take pride in their work. And that's a characteristic that we've noticed within innovative organizations.
And you can't necessarily do that with just, reward, recognition, all of those things help reinforce it. But often there's a core passion there, that there's that strong alignment to the company's values, the strong alignment to the company's direction that really is one of the key drivers of that motivation, I think.
That's absolutely right. Thanks, Janine. In terms of motivation, innovative companies also encourage time and allow for space to pursue passions, and that's part of creating the motivation and that core passion from within. So I've worked with organizations that allow 10 or 15% of your workable time to be towards a project that is a passion project, that's something that's important to you, but equally that also supports the organizational strategy and direction, so that we're still working towards the same outcome and a common goal. And that's quite powerful in some of the more innovative tech organizations these days, such as Google and Yahoo, allowing for that, that time for space and space for passion projects that really excite people. Also empowering staff to surface new ideas. This is not something that is new to you, I'm sure. It's quite common, but the key thing here is enabling people to bring to light ideas without fear of being reprimanded or being felt like it wasn't valued, but just having an opportunity to bring an idea without fear of it being immediately shut down in the least considered. I think that's something that's challenging to do in some organizations that are more set in their ways and have had the same culture and have been doing things a certain way just because that's how it's always been done.
That's right.
And we often forget that changing a culture is still a change, and for that to be successful, it's important to engage people in that process. So changing your culture to be more innovative often means changing people's behavior, how they work, maybe how they think and act, their mindsets. And that in itself is a change. So you need to engage your stakeholders and your people in that process. And it's never too early to ask someone a question to understand their perception on culture and whether they feel it's innovative and where they see the organization going at all levels.
I think whenever we've done exercises around organisational culture, getting your employees involved right at that onset and actually getting their understanding, because often they're aligned with you. They're trying to push for the same sort of organisational change that you're trying to push. So if you're, to your point around that passion, if you're bringing that passion to play in driving that cultural change, then you're already on the upswing, as opposed to if you like to get everything perfect and then come out with your deck or your, this is what it's going to look like. The Netflix deck is a really powerful culture deck, but just creating that overnight and sending it to your employees isn't going to impact your culture. It'll be a lot of pretty slides that you get to look at. So yeah, I think that organisational change management aspect is really key.
Yeah, it's often forgotten as well.
It is often
But I think it's important because culture is not something that can change overnight. It's not with the flip of a switch that we've changed our values, we've posted them on the wall, or we haven't posted them on the wall, and tomorrow the organization will embrace them and shift. It's a long journey, and you have to be patient and committed, and it permeates throughout the entire organization, right down to the front line, even to your customers.
Yeah.
The next attribute we're going to discuss is on the top right of the slide here, and that's learning organizations. So innovative cultures tend to be learning organizations. So there's an acknowledgement and acceptance around taking risks and learning from ideas that may not have worked as planned or may not have been in the direction we wanted to go, or priorities change, whatever it may be. Those ideas or that solution didn't work. And it's about acknowledging that, accepting it, and moving on.
And even, I would say, celebrating the failures, to be able to stand up and say, we tried it, it didn't work, we're really happy that it was brought to bear as an option and that we can move on from that now and we're celebrating it, as opposed to organisations who will start something with a lot of fanfare, this is going to be the next best thing, and then you just find it dwindles.
Yeah.
And I've had organisations I've worked in where, something that was a really exciting opportunity for the business, we decided actually we're not going to go down that path, and leaders really struggled with, well, how do we communicate that? Because we've put so much effort behind it, we don't want to get up and say, actually, we failed. But in fact, failing is not a bad thing if you're learning from it, and it's showing that you're willing to take risks and drive change. So celebrating that's really key.
Yeah, and I might add another example of a great example of a learning organisation. So when this example is not necessarily the organisation itself is a learning organisation, but more the owner really wanted it to be and was pointing out what this organisation was not doing right for it to be learning. That in itself is learning, because you're pulling it up and you're being quite vocal about it. But in this particular example, a FMCG, so a
fast-moving consumer goods
company, was actually trying different ideas to go to market with. And the owner said to the company, basically in an open forum, why do you keep coming up with different ideas? At what point do you pick one and keep at it until you crack it? We didn't crack some of our big blockbuster products in the first time we launched it. In fact, what we did was we kept listening to the customer and molding and changing. What are you all scared about? It's just money.
Yeah.
You are flushing away money, but if you crack it and you actually get to the core of what customers are wanting, you've got something now that you're delivering that's far more powerful than all these little 6-month projects. And I'll never forget that impact, because I thought, wow, I don't think we really thought about it that way. You become so structured that, oh no, that didn't work the first time, that you let it go.
Yeah. So sometimes almost saying 80% is good enough. We're going to go with it, and we're going to continue to hear and adjust and keep improving it.
Yeah, that's a great point, Marianne, and thanks, Janine. And that's something we'll cover in the execution as well, attributes, in terms of often there's no shortage of great ideas that are being surfaced. But really the successful organizations in terms of innovation are those that are able to prioritize and execute on some of them.
Yeah.
And then if they fail, they're learning opportunities, and you may have gained, there may be a silver lining, some insight that will help with your next innovative idea or solution for the customer.
Yeah, it's interesting when you listen to entrepreneurs. If you listen to a Richard Branson, for example, he has had countless ideas and businesses that have not been successful in the end, but they've all been learning experiences, and you will certainly not call him an unsuccessful entrepreneur, I think.
Certainly not. All right, let's move on to risk appetite. It's no secret to any of us that innovation is inherently risky. But what's important to remember is that people need to be empowered to try new things. And we've talked about that quite a bit. But not only will they try new things, but as we said, sometimes it may fail. And that's okay. But the organization you need to create is one that encourages and manages risk. And there's a certain capability that's required to do that around your risk management skills and your processes that allows for that conversation to happen.
I think that's really key as well. You know, we're not saying just go out, try anything. We're saying understand what the risk appetite is in your organization. You know, in highly regulated areas, there will be risks that just aren't tenable. And in other organizations, the risks will look really different. So it's understanding what are the risks, what's your appetite for them, and then skilling people to understand what are the sorts of things that you can push and where can you go and where do you have to pull back and say, no, that's not an area that we can step over.
Yeah, and even with risk appetite, if you think about the culture model, the leaders are at the center of it.
Yeah.
So their reaction to and their ability to grow that capability internally is actually paramount.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. The last attribute, which we chatted about briefly, is execution. So as we said, no shortage of good ideas, but the ability to prioritize, allocate funding, and really execute some of those projects is where the challenge is. And often organizations and our clients get stuck around the prioritization and where do we want to focus? Is this a priority? Does this align with our organizational strategy? Do we have the skills to execute this? Have we heard the questions, and the analysis by paralysis can be quite overwhelming. And I mean, there are certain organizations that may opt to provide a preliminary investment for more experimental projects, and then only decide to fund 2 or 3 of those, you know, based on the outcomes that they achieve and the priorities at the time and the market. And that you can leverage a governance forum or some type of innovation prioritization meeting with the right stakeholders to allow for that, because then you're really moving forward and it's not just idea generation, but actually it's seeing them through to completion.
That's right.
Okay, let's move on to the next slide now that we have a better understanding of what an innovative culture looks like. We know we're in the slot before lunch, which is always a tough one, so we'll make sure we'll get you to lunch before noon here. Cultural awareness. So this is really kind of the call to action for those that have joined the webinar, and a few questions that you can ask yourself, but also others within your organization starting today, because we think it's important to understand your current organizational culture, really get a good grasp of what your perception is, what frontline workers, what the leader's perception is of the culture, because that's your starting point to really use and push and pull on the levers that Marianne walked us through in the cultural change to start shifting towards an innovative culture if that's the direction you want to take. So the first question is, how would I describe my organization's current culture? So is it a value-based culture? Do I feel empowered to share ideas? Do I know what my organizational strategy is? Can I communicate it? What are we all working towards? Those are some questions you can ask yourself, and just keep it quite simple and casual. Just in one line, write down how you would describe your organizational culture. What comes to mind first? Also think about What are employees passionate about? What comes to mind when you think about your staff and what they're working towards and where their energy comes from? How do they get excited about what projects and what areas and teams? What is core to who we are as an organization? So what are our differentiators? What do we want to make sure that remains a focus, even if we're looking to shift our culture to be more innovative? It's important to understand those and not lose sight of those as you go through this cultural change journey. And then also thinking about, where do you want to be? What is your target? What do you want? Where do you aspire your culture to be? And how long? How much commitment and dedication do you want to put into this to achieve that? As we said, it's not something that happens overnight or even in weeks or months. It's something, you know, that you need to dedicate effort, you need to commit to, you need to get your leaders on board and to see the value in shifting the culture and the benefits, and start working towards that with the levers that Marianne touched on. And you may not look at all those levers, and those are the ones we talked about around structure, rituals, values. You may not push them all equally, but you may select one or two to prioritize and focus on those to achieve your outcome, your aspiring culture. And that's what we'll close to wrapping up. I'll hand it over to Janine just to say the closing remarks.
Thanks, Vanessa. And thank you everybody again for your time today. Hopefully what you got out of our session today was first a bit of an understanding as to why we wanted to talk about innovation, and understanding that the research that we did as an organisation into the risk landscape was really pointing to the fact that high-performing companies are innovative and agile. So that's why we wanted to look at it. Then we wanted to understand a little bit more about what culture is and what those underlying things below the surface are, and how they then drive your employees' behaviours. Marianne then took us through the model that we use here around understanding culture and some of those key levers that you can use to drive cultural change. And then Vanessa took us through understanding what that innovative culture actually looks like, and what you might be experiencing as an organisation if you already are innovative, or what are the kinds of things you might want to be reaching towards if that's the kind of culture you want to develop. So hopefully that's given you enough information to start to think about how you might apply that into your organisation. You know, we've worked in this field for a long time, both internally and as consultants, and we know that it's not a simple shift. There's a lot of complexity to creating cultural change. We'd be more than happy to talk to you about it if you have any questions. You know, it's something we're particularly passionate about, so we're always happy to have a cup of coffee or share some emails if you're interested in that. And then I also hope that you'll think about connecting to some of our other webinars if this is really important to your business. So the Risk Landscape webinar is available online, as is the Digital Strategy and Risk webinar that Shane and Ryan did a couple of weeks ago. You'll also find access to this webinar if you want to share it, or if you haven't had a chance to listen to all of it today. And then next week, Adam Sims will be joining us to do a look at forensics and regulatory areas and how they impact on the innovation imperative. So thank you again for your time today. We all hope you have a fantastic afternoon, and we look forward to hearing from you if you've got some interesting questions in this space.
Have a great day.